My name is Abby Butkovich, and my topic for my presentation is Buddhist persecution in Tang, China. So, to start with some background, the Tang dynasty was present in China from the years of 618 to 906 AD. So, during the Tang dynasty in China, there was a period of vast religious exploration. Many faiths began to spread into China, including Christianity, Islam, and the focus of my presentation, Buddhism. So the Buddhist faith was heavily persecuted during the Tang dynasty by Emperor Wuzong. He had thousands of their temples destroyed, their metal objects were melted down for monetary use, and many of the monks and nuns of the Buddhist faith were forced to re-enter lay life. One of the main critiques of Buddhism was just in general regarding their lack of traditional customs. That goes for both the people, like the regular lay people of the Buddhist faith, as well as the monks and nuns. They also had lots of concerns concerning the afterlife that the Buddhists believe in, and the origins of the Buddhist faith. There was a monk of their time named Mao Zhu who countered many of these arguments. He pointed out the importance of both the unspoken and explaining differing paths to fulfillment. So the first critique that we're going to discuss is the concerns that the classic Chinese had about the lives of the monks and how their lives went against the classics' pillars. So Confucians, which was a type of classics, were questioning the fact that the monks shaved their heads. This went against their classic of filial piety, which told them that they were not allowed to do such things as shaving their hair, because it was something they received from their parents. So the idea of the monks shaving their heads to them sounded like them dishonoring their parents, which was not something that people of that time would do ever. So they were just concerned as to why they were going against this classic rule. It was also concerning to non-Buddhists of the time that the monks did not take wives or have children. They were concerned about this because, once again, it went against their classical laws. This devotion to their faith, instead of continuing on one's family name, and providing for them, seemed like a severe opposition to the proper conduct of felicity and filial piety according to the classic laws. The second critique that we're going to be discussing is the various concerns about the lives of the people involved in the faith. So not necessarily just the monks and the nuns, but the regular people lay people who practice their faith. Like people who are Christian, who are not priests or nuns, they're still Christians. So they had concerns about Buddhists, who are people like that, who were doing things that were very different than what classic Chinese society would do. So these people would often reject their family names. And now people will do this a lot nowadays, but back then this was very strange for them to do. The monks and the nuns especially did this, but some of the common Buddhist people would also do it. For them, familial names meant a lot more than they do today. It was their connection to power for a lot of people, and it showed their lineage and their relationship to important people in their lives. Another important point was that their family roles differed. The expected roles of women were different for the Buddhists. The Buddhist women adopted practices that affected their families drastically. There were some Buddhist women who adopted practices called Butkovich practices, and they were strict rules to follow during fasting days, and these drastically changed their daily living. And for some women, eventually even led to death. So there was a woman of this time who was noted to have fasted for so long that she developed a disease and died. These women lived lives of such fasting and prayer that they were constrained by what their faith was, and they were not allowed to do what they needed to through all of their lives. It was also noted that these women, because women are the matriarchs of the family, they influenced their children's, and this was life-altering for their families. Overall, the monks, the nuns, and some of the just traditional Buddhist people lived lives without worldly pleasures. So the classics questioned why those who were Buddhists wished to live without worldly pleasures, why they ate so little, why they lived their lives in lots of hard work and in poverty. They were just overall concerned with their regard of, their well-being and how they were meant to function in Chinese society as it was. The third area of concern of the Buddhist faith that we're going to be discussing is the classic Chinese's concern with the Buddhist belief on the afterlife, as well as their overall concern about the faith's origins. And Buddhism did actually come to China during the Han Dynasty in around 70 AD. But this persecution and the concern about all of these aspects of Buddhist life only really came to play during the Tang Dynasty, like I said before, around 600 to 900 AD. So the Buddhists did not believe in a quote-unquote normal afterlife. They only had some semblance of an afterlife. And it was a way out of this world. Quite literally, they wanted to be out of Earth, and it was called nirvana. It was a lot less of an afterlife than what traditional Christians of that time or of the now would believe in, like heaven. It's much different from that. Nirvana was more of a concept. It was their way out of what they believed was an endless cycle of life and death. They believed that when you die, that you're reborn. Nirvana was a quote-unquote extinction. So it was a way out of this cycle, which was called samsara, of the ancient Indian worldview, and it was guided by karma. They were also concerned with this because, first of all, they were confused about how men could be reborn after they died. But then they were also concerned about the fact that the Buddhists believed that men must die and cannot become immortal. But they also believed that you were living in a samsara cycle of life that was guided by karma. So even though they simply did not believe the same things as the Buddhists in terms of death and the afterlife, their own beliefs on the topics seemed clashing. So this was a concern for the classic Chinese. And another important point brought up against the Buddhists was in relation to where these beliefs originated. The Buddhist beliefs originated in India. And at the time, China, a lot of the people in China believed that the Indians were barbarians, just meaning an outside perspective, and they were not okay with that being a big part of Chinese life. So they're not okay with them using these barbarian tactics in their own society. So after hearing about this persecution and the many concerns that there were about the Buddhist faith, you may be wondering if there was anyone who was standing up for the faith during this time. There was a Buddhist monk who converted actually from Confucianism from one of the classic Chinese pillars to become a Buddhist monk. So he had a really good perspective to explain why these classic Chinese concerns, although valid, were not going to stop people from being Buddhist. So his name was Mao Zhu. So he pointed out how the lack of something being mentioned does not mean that it did not occur or did not have effect on someone. And he also pointed out how each person has their own different path in life and their own different definition of what fulfillment is for them. So his first tactic of explaining the importance of the unmentioned to rebut these arguments against the Buddhist faith was brought up in relation to the Indian influence in China and also the lack of Buddhist ideals in the lives of the classics like the Confucians. So he pointed out that in many of the works of the classics, there are no mentions of Buddha or Buddhist practices in the classics' lives. But he mentioned that just because these classics did not say that they had Buddha or the Buddhist practices in their lives did not mean that they didn't. This was a time of writing only on paper. It was easy to assume that this paper could have been lost, that they just didn't mention it because they were handwriting everything out. There were a lot of reasons that people might not have written this stuff down. They also might not have realized the importance of it. So he was saying that just because the classics did not say that they had Buddha in their lives did not mean that they did not actually have him in their lives. He also said that just because he personally never mentioned the classics of like filial piety and that kind of stuff, as I mentioned before, in his life did not mean that he actually didn't have it. Just because it wasn't mentioned, once again, does not mean that it didn't exist. So the other way I said that he rebutted arguments was just for the differing definitions of fulfillment, which was used to rebut arguments about the lives of the monks, the lives of the others following the faith, and the afterlife. So he pointed out that monks find fulfillment in their wisdom and goodness that they gain when, as opposed to defining fulfillment through marriage and having children. He made sure to express the importance of how differing lives do not mean differing degrees of fulfillment. These monks, although their lives were different from classic Chinese men's lives, were still able to receive the same degree of fulfillment without being married and having children. Their practice of the Buddhist faith allowed them to become fulfilled in their lives. It was also prevalent, he pointed out, that Buddhists did not only believe in fulfillment in this life. Because of their samsara cycle and eventual entrance into their concept of nirvana, they wanted fulfillment in every life. So they believed that having fulfillment in the life they were living in then would allow them to lead fulfilled lives, like full of their virtues that they practiced in their next life. Whereas the classic Chinese did not believe in this cycle. They believed in being fulfilled in their life with their family at the time. So just because the monks didn't have this family did not mean they weren't fulfilled, and that's what he pointed out. So the main critiques of Buddhism that I covered were the lack of traditional customs, the lives of the monks, and the beliefs about the afterlife and the origins of the faith. And the man Mao Zhu countered these arguments, and he explained the different definitions of fulfillment and defined the importance of the understanding of the unspoken. It was likely that persecution of this faith was due to the Chinese citizens just not understanding the faith practices of the Buddhists, and they were very set in their classic Chinese ways. So therefore, it is easy to understand how learning more information about this faith makes the concerns regarding the Buddhist faith seem a lot less drastic, and Mao Zedong's arguments for the faith make a lot more sense. The Buddhists were sadly heavily persecuted during the Tang dynasty in China due to the confusion and concern by part of the Chinese citizens of that time period.